Welcome, everyone. I'm Diana Ingram. I'm the Executive Director here at Hill Center. Pay no attention to the men behind the curtain. I just have to ask, is there anyone who has never been here in the building before? Oh, super. Welcome. Please come back. Please look at all the information that's on your chairs. We have a lot going on here. A couple of housekeeping notes. Do put in your diaries our Pottery on the Hill, a functional pottery fair at the end of October over Halloween weekend. It's a must-attend, so please be here. And the next Talk of the Hill with Bill Press will be a conversation with author Paul Theroux about his new book, Deep South, 4 Seasons on the Back Roads. Please take a moment to turn off your mobile devices. And I'm going to turn this over to host of Talk of the Hill, Bill Press, who has interviewed just about anybody who's anybody and has created a fabulous evening tonight with some surprise things. So let me turn it over to Bill.
Thank you, Diana. Thanks so much for coming tonight. And I am very excited to be joined tonight by Charles Francis, who is head of the Mattachine Society here in Washington, D.C., and started the project and the investigation that resulted in this powerful and yet disgusting story that we're going to hear about tonight, learn about tonight. And also to be joined by Michael Isikoff, a good friend for a long time, one of the very best top investigative reporters in the country at Newsweek, at NBC News, and now at Yahoo News, who created this documentary. Now here's what we're going to do. We're going to watch the documentary. It's 30 minutes. It's my kind of documentary. Won't even fall asleep in that. It's 30 minutes. Then we'll talk about it until it's time for the CNN debate. And I know many of you may be worried about missing any part of the debate. Diana has arranged that we can actually stay here and watch the second debate if you care to. Right. And so, Michael, tell us what we're about to see.
It sounds like a quite schizophrenic evening. But anyway, I'd like to have this film speak for itself. All I can say is it was, for me, to make this an absolutely fascinating subject that got me into a whole era of American history that I don't think most people know very much about. I certainly didn't until I started doing this. And having gotten into this project, it really opened my eyes to a really sorry chapter in our very recent past. And with that, we should just watch the movie.
Charles, let me ask you, first of all, any idea how many people were, A, harassed, and B, actually fired from the federal government over this time?
They can't answer that question, but when you look at it, it's really not an exaggeration to say untold tens of thousands of gay men and women beginning in 1950 put through the meat grinder of investigations, terminations, and run out of town. And most of them shredded everything, never looked back. And the government sat on all that paper until this was burned, but untold thousands.
Michael, how did you discover this whole story?
Well, it's fascinating. Look, I've been an investigative reporter all my life. I've had a keen interest in government abuses, government secrecy. Always was fascinated by the FBI and the Hoover era and COINTELPRO, the harassment of civil rights leaders and dissidents. And about a year ago, I had dinner with a mutual friend of ours. I didn't really know Charles at that time, who started telling me about the work that Charles was doing in this area and about gays. And I said, "Wow, I, consider myself a fairly knowledgeable guy, but I was not familiar with this."
Yeah, good.
Right.
Wonderful.
And just as from that perspective alone, of somebody who's sort of studied government, written about government abuses. I wanted to hear more. I had lunch with Charles and his colleague Pate Phelps back in January, and they showed me some of these documents, including the J. Edgar Hoover green pencil memo, something I had never seen before. And I went back and looked at some of the histories of the FBI and Hoover, many of which I had on my bookshelf, and there was barely a mention of this. So you'd occasionally see a reference to it, but none of the detail. And then you digging into it, and you see that, it's really astonishing just how sweeping it was. And what struck me was that those later abuses that we know about, COINTELPRO, have their seeds in the targeting and harassment of gays in the 1950s, all ordered directly by the man whose name still decorates the FBI headquarters on Pennsylvania Avenue.
We'll get to that in just a moment.
Sure.
But Charles, and by the way, for those of us sometimes who think that one person cannot make a difference, I would suggest you see the story of Charles Francis. I was struck by the silence of the media when all this happened. You showed a lot of clips, but the clips were all about so many perverts or so many homos were fired, right? I didn't see any there that said, what's going on here is wrong and un-American at the time.
Yeah, there was no media coverage. In those days, the media didn't look at gays and lesbians as a group that had any claim on civil equality. We were absolutely invisible. When Frank Kameny would go to the Supreme Court to try to get his job back, he filed a petition for cert. The court turned him down, and he wrote about it in a little 1-inch splib in the Washington Star. No one covered it, none. Which is another reason why working with Mike has been such a pleasure, because he truly understands this stuff, rooted in the history of J. Edgar Hoover and what really happened. Tom Brokaw recently wrote a book on the 60s called Boom. And Boom did not even mention Stonewall or gay civil rights movement of the 60s. So the media is learning now. I think they're there now, but until it's recent.
But it is also, if I could just chime in at a point I've made at a couple of other discussions we've had, this is a continual reminder of why history needs to constantly be studied and rewritten. The classic example I use is in 1945, Arthur Schlesinger Jr. wrote a biography of Andrew Jackson that won the Pulitzer Prize that makes no mention at all of Indian removal. The indigenous Americans who Andrew Jackson removed from their lands, Trail of Tears, all those horror stories of that era, it was all invisible to Americans at that time. And in many ways, this strikes me as very much sort of the same thing. And in a group that was invisible for many years in the eyes of historians, we need to revisit our history so we understand it in the present context.
And maybe that includes a history of President Dwight D. Eisenhower. We're about to soon start construction, once the final approvals, of a monument to President Eisenhower down on Independence Avenue. There are more stories now written about that. Ike invited Martin Luther King Jr. to the White House, so he was really the start of the first president to really recognize the importance of the civil rights movement. And yet, he signed this rule or executive order banning anybody, any LGBT people from serving in the federal government.
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned President Eisenhower. He was trapped in a problem. The head of Citizens for Eisenhower was a young man named Arthur Vandenberg Jr. And Arthur Vandenberg Jr. was the son of the iconic senator from Michigan. And so Arthur Jr. heads up Citizens Eisenhower for Eisenhower nationwide, 50 states, the grassroots for Ike. And more than that, he wrapped Eisenhower in the mantle of his father, who was an internationalist. And when Ike was fighting for the nomination against Taft, Taft was isolation. So young Vandenberg said, look, my dad supports, on his deathbed, supports Ike. He got the nomination. So now in December 1952, he's president-elect. His first meeting with J. Edgar Hoover in New York. Hoover comes in there and goes, Mr. President-elect, your aide and your head of your grassroots is a homosexual, and here's all the paperwork. So Eisenhower fires young Vandenberg in January before the inaugural, and Vandenberg leaves town, destroyed. Then Vandenberg maintains the friendship. Ike felt very bad about it. He knew something was wrong. Eisenhower was a decent guy, and he would invite young Vandenberg back to the White House for what they called stag dinners and conversations and tell me about your travels, blah, blah, blah. Hoover couldn't stand that. So Hoover arranges for Confidential magazine to run a cover story, who is this pansy in the White House? And so Vandenberg gets it again, and then he gets fired from his teaching job, and now he's truly ruined. And this goes back to Hoover, Hoover, Hoover. And Eisenhower didn't have the gumption to say no.
Just to take its story forward a little bit, the Eisenhower executive order, which declared sexual perversion a threat to national security, meant that gays could not get security clearances. So they couldn't be in any sensitive job in which they would need a security clearance. That also included government contractors. But that policy actually got expanded over the years under a guy by the name of John Macy, who was a Kennedy appointee to be chairman of the Civil Service Commission, and then served under Lyndon Johnson. And that's where the policy that led to Charlie Baker being fired, because at that point it went from you're a security threat to you're not suitable for federal employment because if you're gay, you're going to be disruptive to the federal workforce, you're going to make other people feel uncomfortable, they think you're going to get hit on or something. So it became an absolute ban in the 60s for any gay to work for the government. The Eisenhower executive order got expanded.
All right, before we go to the audience, and I have to ask you, Charles, there's an oblique reference to it earlier. If you go down Pennsylvania, the FBI building has the J. Edgar Hoover over the door. What are you going to do about that? Anything? Can you?
Well, yes, we think it's a stain and a shame to have that name on the FBI building, especially when the FBI needs support, needs respect, and performs such a valuable role in our country. And Hoover, knowing now what we know, not just gays, good Lord, not just gays. I mean, Hoover tried to destroy Martin Luther King. Hoover tried to infiltrate the civil rights movement. Women. He made illegal any kind of lawful dissent. Hoover was a monster. And we've taken down the Confederate flag, and I think it's now time to put J. Edgar Hoover to rest.
I'll add one.
Now, would that, if I may ask, would that include getting him out of Congressional Cemetery?
Well, where he's buried next to Clyde Tolson.
That's true. But along those lines, there is also a stretch of federal highway in New Hampshire, I-93, runs from Concord to the Vermont state line, called the Stiles Bridges Highway. Stiles Bridges is the guy who led the blackmailing that led to the death of Senator Lester Hunt. A really astonishing story in my view. A couple of years ago, there was an editorial in the Boston Globe saying it's time to take Stiles Bridges' name off that highway, and we'll see if people who see this movie, if it inspires any further talk.
You might get one of those whitehouse.gov petitions going. I bet you could get a lot of people on the Hoover thing, particularly. Do we have the lights off, Diana, for a reason? Do we need to, or?
Okay, well, if you raise your hand even in the dark, we can probably see you. Oh, I see. And wait, okay, so we need the microphone up front here with lots of hands. And we go as fast as we can. Where's the microphone? Oh, it's coming. Okay. Yeah. Just come up the front aisle. And remember, we do have a time limit, so keep your questions and we'll try to keep your answers. Okay? I'm sorry. Yes.
This work?
Go on.
Okay. Mr. Francis, how do you feel about President Obama in that he has done the most probably of any president to advance gay rights, and yet he is still kind of had to get prodded by Vice President Biden to do the to support gay marriage, and then he's been a little bit slow, so to speak, about ENDA, among other things. How do you feel personally about the president?
I feel very, very positive about him. Of course, we have a long way to go. We still have the job discrimination issue in this country against gay people. But having done my best, you saw it, trying to convince George W. Bush, look at the distance that we have traveled. And President Obama has been amazing. And of course, it takes grassroots pressure, it takes political pressure. But I'm very impressed with what President Obama has done.
Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm.
Were Hoover and McCarthy aligned in pursuing the homosexual?
So the question is whether J. Edgar Hoover and Joe McCarthy were aligned. Michael, Charles.
I think they were sort of generally in the same same position, same perspective. But it's worth saying that this was widely shared at the time. I mean, and it cut across party lines. The memo that we quote from, which is years later, was giving a sort of cultural perspective on how homosexuality was viewed during that era, and I think that was now McCarthy and Hoover took it to the nth degree. They really then used it for really harsh and in harsh and sinister ways, and I think that's what makes them stand out.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Isikoff, one thing I noticed was that when the newspapers did cover us, they covered us in the most pejorative terms I've ever seen. The word homosexual was not used. It was always sexual deviance. It's almost as like Frank Luntz was coming up with the headlines. Can you comment on that? It sounds like we weren't getting
you
objective.
saw the memo from J. Edgar Hoover. I mean, there's no reference to homosexuality. It's sex deviance, and that's at the time it was pretty much synonymous.
The first journalist in my lifetime that came through and really understood this subject and could ask the second and the third question would be Frank Rich at the New York Times.
Yes, please.
Thanks very much for this documentary.
Excuse me. That's because Frank Rich comes from Washington, D.C.
Yes.
Right.
He knows this stuff.
Yeah, he's good.
And it's especially powerful because you have your personal witness and your involvement with Texas politics and George W. Bush. And of course, you could pick all kinds of politicians who've betrayed or double-crossed the gay and lesbian, the LGBT community. But one thing I wanted to ask y'all is, in terms of the legacy of J. Edgar Hoover and the media's coverage or lack of coverage, and I offer you this
Question.
the question is, did any of you look into the fact that the museum served as the sponsor and host for a celebration of the 75th anniversary of the FBI, using as the excuse that for security reasons the FBI had to close its public museum there in the great monstrous building. And I was covering the museum. And the other thing that I would offer as a contrast.
We need a question. We've a lot of people, a lot of time.
Okay.
So let's just take that as a question.
Sure.
Okay, please, Michael.
I was not aware of that, familiar with it. I'd be interested in learning more. But look, I mean, the FBI today is not the FBI then. Clearly, things have changed. The director, James Comey, I actually asked him. He has a regular sort of meeting with the press every few months, and I asked him about taking J. Edgar Hoover's name off the building just a few months ago. Yeah, and he kind of danced around it. I think he's got the FBI Agents Association, which does have the old Hooverites in there. So I think he's not looking for any additional fights that he needs. But he's certainly aware. He gave a very powerful speech early in the last year about Hoover's abuses in civil rights, in which he says he has on his desk the order that Hoover got from RFK, Bobby Kennedy, to wiretap Martin Luther King, and he uses that as a constant reminder of the excesses and abuses of the FBI in the past. So he's aware of all that, and he's aware of this story as well.
One more question up front, and then we'll go to the back of the room. I see your hands. Yes.
Can you say something about the destruction of the records? Who did it? Why? And what survived for you to look at?
Mm-hmm. Good, great question. You want to start
Yeah,
on that?
I'll start. I mean, I've seen the memo. There's a destruction memo where this is to the National Archives saying we would like permission to destroy the sex perverts in government service files. And what they said in the memo is, this has all sorts of personal information about people's private lives that's not suitable for any sort of public airing, and so therefore it should be destroyed. Now, what had happened at the time is the Freedom of Information Act had just recently been passed that was going to open up government files. So in one sense, you could understand why they would want to keep those files, why they would want them destroyed. But in the other sense, also, they were covering their own tracks. And it's pretty clear that by keeping those files in existence, it would tell the world about what the FBI had been doing in tracking and collecting these files in the first place. And that was not something the FBI wanted.
And what we're doing to find stuff that survived, we're in a partnership with the law firm McDermott, Will, and Emery. They have 13 lawyers volunteered to work with us, and we have discovered the papers of John Macy at the LBJ Library. Macy was the head of the Civil Service Commission. He was running this machine of investigation and firing of gays for being revolting. So we try to get Macy's papers. The LBJ says, sorry, they're sealed. They haven't been opened. I said, sealed? It's 50 years. Sealed. And I said, well, we'll FOIA it. They said, no, the LBJ is not subject to FOIA because FOIA starts in 78. And so then we kept coming at them, and they said, okay, well, we have an agreement with Macy's estate, privacy agreement. And I said, well, let's see the privacy agreement. And we kept at it. Finally, they said, okay, we're going to process these 50 boxes, and we're going to get them open, and it's going to take a year. So now we're hoping next year we get the papers of John Macy. Mm-hmm. And we'll go through them. And I think we're going to see horrendous firings and investigations of people who fought. Sorry?
Where'd you get the stuff that you had?
Well, what I got that got me rolling on this whole thing was Frank Kameny. Dr. Franklin Kameny was a friend of mine. And as he was approaching 80, I said, Frank, you have an amazing collection of paper in your attic. Let us get it appraised, let us get it saved, and let us give it to the Library of Congress, which is what we did. And in that process, I went through all of Frank's papers and just could not believe my eyes what I was seeing and reading. And that got us on the path. Who was Macy? What was he saying? All that was in Frank's attic. And no media coverage in the day. So we're looking at mimeographs and carbon copies and, tissue copies. And we found it all. So thanks that Frank was a pack rat.
Too bad he didn't have his own email server at home. Question in the back?
I have a couple questions. If
Yes.
I could.
Do you have the microphone? I can't see.
I do.
Okay,
yeah.
go.
Are you familiar with David Johnson's excellent book by the University
Yeah,
of Chicago?
David Johnson's on our board of the new Mattachine Society. He's brilliant. It's called the Lavender Scare, and he wrote the first real history, as far as I'm concerned. Well, that was 10 or 12 years ago. And he got a lot of material from Frank and did a lot of work at the State Department to outline the Lavender Scare, and it's brilliant. We're building on that.
I think it's a movie now as well, a documentary.
It's been optioned. The movie hadn't been completed.
Yeah.
So in that book, he talks a lot about the Hoey investigation, Senator Hoey. Do you get into that in your work?
We are looking at the early roots in Hoey and in the Senate with Senator James McClellan from Arkansas, who held the first perverts in government hearings. And we have gone to Arkansas archives to get our hands on those materials. And we've gone into closed door sessions files, and we've gotten those materials, and they're hair raising.
Can you pass the microphone to the gentleman in the back, please?
Hi, I'm curious mostly about the power that Hoover had, and can you say anything about how he managed to conceal his own private life in light of everything he was pursuing?
Yeah, you know,
Hoover's private life. You want to go first?
No, I will. That is a fascinating subject, and of course, look. You look at Hoover's relationship with Clyde Tolson, and it is, clearly unusually close. They had lunch together, they had dinner together, they vacationed together. You look at some of the photos of the two of them together, and there's clearly an intimacy there. They're married in adjoining, they're buried in adjoining plots at Congressional Cemetery. Charles has described the relationship as spousal. No one knows what went on behind closed doors, between the two of them, and there's been much that's been in movies. There's no definitive version of that, but it is clear from the documents that Charles has gotten that rumors about Hoover's sexuality were quite rampant at the time, and whenever this would get reported to the FBI and to Hoover, he ordered agents to come down on whoever was spreading these rumors with a ton of bricks. And there's some fascinating memos that Charles had, which, by the way, if you go online, you can find not only a documentary, but a lot of Charles documents. This is all on Yahoo's website, and a piece I did that does deal with this subject. And Hoover would order investigations of people who he heard were suggesting that he was, in the FBI memos, a queer. And Clyde Tolson would have to report back to him on what the agents found. They actually threatened people here in Washington. If you ever were to say that again, you will lose your job, be prosecuted, have the full weight of the FBI against you. It's some fascinating stuff. So I urge you to take a look.
Quick comment, Charles, before we get the last question.
Well, the question of whether he had a sexual relationship with Tolson is secondary to the real problem of the destruction he meted out to gay people for decades. And we're less interested in the bedroom with Hoover than we are with why was he obsessed with destroying gay men and women in this country for so many decades.
Maybe because of what happened in the bedroom. But yes, do we have one final question? I can't see there, right? Yes, Michael.
You were talking earlier, I think in the film they brought up the Walter Jenkins case, and you brought up the fact that Eisenhower was pressured or something like that, or trapped was the word I think used. And in context, it's sort of, I think, what I remember well about Walter Jenkins was that happened during the heat of the election in 1964 when there was really feared that that was going to do great damage, which it didn't do. But the Johnson family, you remember that Mrs. Johnson made a very eloquent statement about fatigue being a poor advisor. And everyone thought that was just a wonderful statement on her part, which it was. And then the Johnson family privately rallied to Mr. Jenkins and brought him back to Austin. He became a distinguished executive for the LBJ broadcasting system and was revered by the family and loved by all. But of course, Mr. Macy was also, working for Mr. Johnson. So it's all complicated, contextual, and about friendship and political causes all being, I think, intertwined.
The Walter Jenkins case, Charles, just a quick comment?
Do you want to speak about Walter Jenkins?
I think you're certainly true that there was a great deal of fear that it would be a political bombshell, as LBJ says in the tapes. But one of the things that Johnson did do, right at the height of that, when he got asked by the press, is he immediately brought up Arthur Vandenberg.
He said, yeah, that Vandenberg fellow, Ferry's worked for presidencies in the past, so now...
It's not just us,
So Vandenberg gets dragged into it another time.
Had this problem,
But Jenkins did not come up with a new synthesis. He goes back to Austin, and he doesn't change after Stonewall. He doesn't lend a hand. I mean, good night. Can you imagine how helpful he could have been to Frank Kameny if he would pick up the phone and give him a little bit of advice on the Congress? He didn't. He just crawled under a rock, basically.
Well, I've been trying to think of the transition, and I'm not sure there is a good one. Let me just say, we're about to go from the uniquely nasty to the uniquely weird, with Donald Trump being the Republican frontrunner about to take stage. But what a great job, what a powerful documentary, what a sobering reminder, General. Thank you so much.
Let me say one thing. If you appreciated this, we are trying to get this in front of as many people as possible. It's all online if you want to post it on your Facebook pages or tweet or anything that could help, get more of an audience for this.
Go to Yahoo.
Yahoo, if you just do a search, Uniquely Nasty, my name, Charles Francis's name, you'll come up with it, and there'll be a whole, the link to the film and a lot of the documents that you see, you can read for yourselves. You'll see those as well. In June.
In June.
The week before the same-sex marriage decision.
Yeah.
And if anybody here has an attic full of boxes and papers, let us know.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you.